dari perguruan tinggi perguruan yang lain di Indonesia kerjasama dengan perkumpulan program studi sejarah se-Indonesia, ya, PPSI. Ini di sini ada Presiden PPSI, Dr. Ilham, dan Sekjen PPSI, Ibu Dr. Roma. Selamat pagi. Baik. Sudah. Selamat pagi. Baik, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, salam sehat untuk kita semua. Kita akan memulai kuliah pagi hari ini bersama Profesor Dr. Marike Bloembergen dari Universitas Leiden. Dan sebelumnya kita akan Oke. Kuliah akan dilakukan bahasa Inggris, tetapi saya kira pada pembukaan ini kita memakai bahasa Indonesia. Saya persilakan Kepala Departemen Sejarah Universitas Gadjah Mada untuk menyampaikan sepatah atau dua patah kata, tapi jangan berpatah-patah. Saya persilakan Dr. Abdul Wahid.
Terima kasih Pak Agus. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi semua rekan-rekan yang hadir di ruangan di Subondo ini. Selamat pagi juga untuk rekan-rekan yang ada di beberapa universitas di Indonesia. Terima kasih sekali sudah bergabung. Ini momen yang sangat membahagiakan sekali. Pada pagi hari ini kita akan memulai kegiatan perkuliahan semester ini dengan stadium general, dan kita sangat berbahagia sekali pada kesempatan ini karena Profesor Dr. Marike Bloembergen dari Universitas Leiden berkenan untuk hadir memberikan nanti materinya. Dan thank you so much Marike for your coming, also for sharing your lecture and information maybe about your research better. And I heard it will be also part of your professorship lecture. So yeah. Jadi teman-teman semuanya, kita hari ini akan mendengarkan kuliah perdana, kuliah pembuka untuk semester ini, dan sebagian besar teman-teman they are new students from BA but also MA program. Tapi juga kita juga sudah terhubung. We are connected already with almost 12 university all over Indonesia actually, so this will be a very huge audience. So ya, rekan-rekan semua, silakan berikan perhatian Anda dan juga konsentrasi Anda pada kuliah hari ini. Kalau perlu silakan mencatat dan nanti bisa mengajukan pertanyaan. Kuliah mungkin akan diberikan dalam bahasa Inggris, tapi nanti juga bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia tanya jawabnya. Ya, so this, program semester ini adalah program rutin yang diselenggarakan oleh Departemen Sejarah, dan pagi ini kita jadikan sebagai kuliah pembuka untuk semester ini. So, ya, selamat mengikuti perkuliahan ini. Rekan-rekan semuanya yang di Zoom, selamat bergabung juga dengan kuliah perdana ini. So, saya kembalikan waktu kepada Pak Agus selanjutnya. Terima kasih. Saya tutup. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih Pak Wahid. Ini kuliah perdana untuk Departemen Sejarah GM, dan saya tidak tahu apakah di perguruan tinggi lain juga kuliah perdana ada. Tapi yang jelas, saya kira model perkuliahan dengan broadcast ini yang pertama, saya kira, yang saya tahu untuk prodi sejarah. Saya akan menyapa dulu satu persatu ya, teman-teman kita di berbagai perguruan tinggi yang lain. Ya, Mas Ruhan mohon bersiap untuk menampilkan. Pertama saya sapa Bapak dan Ibu dosen serta teman-teman mahasiswa dari program studi sejarah Universitas Hasanuddin Makassar. Hasanuddin, monitor. Selamat pagi. Hasanuddin, monitor. Selamat pagi. Assalamualaikum. Hasanuddin bawah itu. Hasanuddin monitor, selamat pagi, assalamualaikum. Bapak Ibu dan mahasiswa dari Departemen Sejarah Universitas Hasanuddin, assalamualaikum. Selamat pagi. Kita beri tepuk tangan untuk teman-teman dari Sejarah. Baik, selanjutnya saya sapa Bapak Ibu dosen dan teman-teman mahasiswa dari Universitas Haluoleo Kendari. Haluoleo Kendari. Haluoleo Kendari, assalamualaikum. Halo. Selamat. Ya, suaranya belum terdengar ya. Oke. Selamat pagi, ya selamat siang ya di Kendari. Selamat siang ya. Selamat pagi, terima kasih. Berikutnya saya sapa Bapak Ibu dosen dan teman-teman dari program studi Sejarah Peradaban Islam UIN Kalijaga Yogyakarta. Selamat pagi, assalamualaikum Bapak Ibu, ya sehat ya. Oke, bisa kita beri tepuk tangan kepada teman-teman dari Kalijaga Yogyakarta. Kita bergeser masih di Jogja, saya sapa teman-teman dari program studi ilmu sejarah dan pendidikan sejarah Universitas Negeri Yogyakarta. Selamat pagi Yogyakarta. Silakan, ya boleh. Viva Historia. Viva Historia. Kita beri tepuk tangan. Terima kasih. Kita ke Banten. Teman-teman dari Bapak Ibu dosen dan para mahasiswa dari program studi ilmu sejarah Universitas Sultan Agung Tirtayasa Banten. Banten, selamat pagi, assalamualaikum. Viva Historia. Viva Historia. Beri tepuk tangan teman-teman dari Banten. Baik, kita akan ke Malang ya, teman-teman dan Bapak Ibu dosen dari program studi pendidikan sejarah Universitas Malang. Assalamualaikum. Persilakan, saya persilakan. Mau ada sapa atau yel-yel Malang? Ya, terima kasih. Kita beri tepuk tangan kepada teman-teman di Malang. Dari Malang kita bergeser 1 jam kepada teman-teman program dan Bapak Ibu dosen dari program studi ilmu sejarah Universitas Airlangga Surabaya. Surabaya. Pak Laude, Dr. Laude Rabani, dan Bapak Sarkawi, dan Bapak Profesor Purnawan. Saya persilakan. Surabaya. Oke, Surabaya belum ya. Kita bergeser sedikit ke Jember. Bapak Ibu dosen dan teman-teman mahasiswa dari program studi Sejarah Universitas Jember. Selamat pagi, assalamualaikum. Saya persilakan menyapa. Ya, kita beri tepuk tangan teman-teman mahasiswa Jember ya, dari Jember kita ke Padang. Bapak Ibu dosen dan teman-teman mahasiswa dari program studi ilmu sejarah Universitas Andalas Padang. Saya persilakan. Padang, monitor, monggo. Silakan kalau mau menyapa. Ya, oke, kita beri tepuk tangan ya pada teman-teman di Padang. Kemudian yang lain yang belum saya sebut, teman-teman dari program studi Sejarah Universitas Sanata Dharma Yogyakarta. Tidak ada ya, daftar saya terima. Silakan, ada Pak Rio. Oke, Pak, belum ada videonya. Baik. Oke. Ya. Itu Surabaya tidak boleh. Kita Surabaya. Oke. Teman-teman. Oke, kita sebentar. Satu dulu. Pak Rio, apakah akan menampilkan video?
Videonya belum terkoneksi.
Oke, nanti ya, nanti aja. Kalau begitu, sambil menunggu Pak Rio dan teman-teman di USD untuk menyampaikan diri, kita sapa kembali teman-teman dari Universitas Airlangga Surabaya. Terima kasih, salam semuanya. Terima kasih Pak Laudi, Sarah dan Bapak Ibu dosen Surabaya, salam sehat selalu ya. Salam sehat. Kita sekarang dari Surabaya ke Semarang, Bapak Ibu dosen dan teman-teman mahasiswa dari program studi Sejarah Pendidikan Sejarah Universitas Negeri Semarang, ada Dr. Nina dan teman-teman. Selamat pagi, Bu Nina. Selamat pagi, Assalamualaikum, salam sehat. Oke, baik. Yang lain, apakah Manado gabung? Tadi saya sebut belum muncul. Belum ya, belum ada. Baik. Nanti kalau join mohon menyampaikan ke kami supaya bisa kami sapa. Baik. Semua sudah hadir dan kita akan segera mulai. We are going to start the lecture soon, and then thanks a lot for your presence here. We are very honored to have you for this very wonderful opportunity in the beginning of the academic year. And in front of us and also here online, we are joined by mostly new students but also undergraduate and graduate students of different universities throughout Indonesia, and we are hoping they all will have some in the coming hours, they will raise some questions regarding studying colonial history and also taking inspirations from your lecture. Ibu Marike Bulbergen, Profesor Dr. Marike Bulbergen adalah guru besar di Universitas Leiden Belanda yang akan pagi ini atau siang hari ini akan berbicara mengenai studi kolonial dengan melalui beberapa pendekatan antara lain heritage studies dan juga pertanyaan mengenai metodologi. Saya kira untuk sebagian dari kita yang sudah belajar ilmu sejarah atau pendidikan sejarah, topik-topik ini menjadi fondasi untuk mengajukan pertanyaan lebih lanjut. So the lecture will start soon, and you have more or less 1 hour to do your lecture, and then we are going to take questions afterwards. Okay? And now time is yours, Marika.
Selamat pagi mahasiswa, kolega dan teman dari Universitas Gadjah Mada dan juga dari 12 universitas lain di Indonesia. Saya sangat terhormat untuk memberi opening lecture tahun akademi baru untuk semua Departemen Sejarah di Indonesia. Saya minta maaf untuk berbicara dalam bahasa Inggris nanti, tetapi nanti kalau ada pertanyaan atau diskusi, tetap bisa juga dalam bahasa Indonesia. So, dari itu sebuah ritual akademis, pembukaan tahun akademia, dan dari ritual itu saya jump ke ritual lain. So, recently, in May this year, I was at the center of another academic ritual when I gave my oratie, or inaugural address, which is a ritual to confirm my nomination of Professor in Heritage and Postcolonial Studies in Indonesian History at Leiden University. It was a ritual marking a transition quite typical for Dutch academic traditions. It involved colleague professors dressed up, like myself, in cloaks and gowns or togas, forming a cortege following me to the pulpit. There was the pedel, a figure that chairs the ceremony, also in gown, you see him here, and old professors on paintings watching over, and the public with friends and colleagues. This was a surreal Harry Potter experience, also for me. But it was also the typical kind of academic ritual through which hierarchies of expertise and knowledge formation are legitimized, and that formed the central topic of my lecture. With that lecture, I engaged with debates on decolonizing academia, museums and heritage institutions as these evolve globally, but also in the Netherlands and between the Netherlands and Indonesia, and Dutch and Indonesian official institutions. The lecture is, however, also relevant for the way we frame, study and understand colonial and post-colonial history, both in the Netherlands and in Indonesia, where we are confronted with different yet also related problems of framing and understanding that history. Therefore, I'm all the more delighted and pleased that I can present this inaugural address here today and hear your thoughts on that matter. So let me return to that day in May and deliver that lecture. You do not see it, but that day I explained to my audience that I was contributing to a better world. For I was wearing a leen toga, or a borrowing gown, from Leiden University. Thus, I was reusing, recycling, deconsuming. Incidentally, the particular toga I was wearing also connects to histories of colonial and post-colonial knowledge production on Indonesia and wider Asia. The original owner of this more than 40-year-old toga was the energetic philologist and polyglot Johannes Gijsbertus de Casparis. De Casparis was a language official in colonial Indonesia, learned Thai as a forced laborer on the Burma Railway, engaged with Indonesian anti-colonial historians, and after many wanderings in South and Southeast Asia and around the world of Asia scholars, became a professor of archaeology and ancient history of South and Southeast Asia at Leiden University. De Casparis was small in stature, so he wore heels to be taken seriously in height as well. The gown fitted me. I was deconsuming voluntarily, but as is often the case with good behavior, I also did so out of self-interest. For the social-political biography, the question of the colonial dimensions of this gown, or the toga, and the knowledge networks of its original owner are relevant to my chair and to the university, but also to the universities in Indonesia, I would say. However, I also mentioned the example of the borrowed toga because of the act of borrowing. Borrowing, exchanging, reusing and recycling, anti-materialism, deconsuming, renouncing, vegetarianism and spiritual seeking as alternative forms, reform-oriented practices of knowledge production are central to this lecture, in which I try to answer the following questions. Why and how should we interpret the political aspects of knowledge production? What role do objects like a toga play in this? And what will it yield if we focus not on collecting and accumulation, but on what seems to be the opposite? Deconsuming, taking distance of the worldly matters we longed for, and the striving for the spiritual side of life. In my field, it is not obvious to examine the politics and practices of deconsumption and collecting, of anti-materialism and of greed, and the role of knowledge in all of this in one single framework. Here I want to discuss them in relation to each other as a field in which different ideas and ideals about human and world progress converge, intersect, collide, or pass by. To fulfill the mission of the chair I am appointed to, I research the networks of heritage and knowledge production in Indonesia in transnational, intercolonial, and post-colonial context. In the title of the chair, Heritage and Post-Colonial Studies in Indonesian History, heritage, for me, stands for what people do when they form cultural knowledge and the political implications of that. That is, if through mechanisms of exchange and power relations, they again and again give meanings to objects, texts, places, ideas, rituals, like this one, and exclude other meanings. From this perspective, heritage formation is an aspect of knowledge formation and a political process. Postcolonial studies stands for the critical study of the way in which history is researched and made. So I think very relevant for you, for today. Crucial to this is showing who we do and who we do not follow when we study and write about history. The chair's mission, therefore, encompasses the relationship between knowledge production and inequality. The question is, what is it that makes this relationship colonial? Now, it is not just the gown, that toga, that I reused that day, that embodied the colonial. It was also the academic building where I was delivering my lecture. There, the Japanese and colonial subject Hussein Jayadiningrat was the first Indonesian to defend his PhD thesis in history in 1913 on the history of his native region of Banten. And you see him here on the right and on the left side his Dutch secondants when he delivered his, when he defended his PhD thesis. On the right, you see a statue that was built to honor Jayadiningrat at Leiden University in 2004, also emphasizing Leiden University's wish to collaborate with Indonesia. Now, even though Leiden University now makes a good impression with that statue, Jayadiningrat did his PhD at the time as one of the happy few, something about which Leiden University also could feel uneasy. In post-colonial Indonesia, on the other hand, Jayadiningrat was mistrusted for his extremely successful colonial career in administration and cultural politics. All of this says a lot about the principle of difference that characterizes colonial relationships and how this affects post-colonial times, both in the Netherlands and in Indonesia. What exactly the colonial and the violence of that entails, however, is not always immediately visible, neither in the academic building nor in the toga or the gown. If we want to know how colonialism affects the way we study Indonesia and how knowledge about Indonesia takes place, we must ask ourselves, and this is something that is relevant for the study of history in general. What is colonial about the sources and knowledge on which we base ourselves, and why? What is local or subaltern or anti-colonial about it, and why? And how do our own frameworks and the academic traditions that shape us determine what and who we see and who we do not see? These questions are relevant to the debate on the decolonization of museums and academic institutions, and they guide my lecture. Just like the borrowing and lending of this gong, knowledge production is never merely disinterested. Precisely in this borrowing and lending, in this exchange, lies the beginning of an answer to the questions I just asked. Martijn Eikhoff and I experienced this during our research into heritage formation in Indonesia, when we were inspired by the classic essay sur le don, or essay on the gift, by the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss. Starting from his concept of exchange, we understood the relationships of interdependence that arise when we lend, sell, or give something to each other. It became clear to us how power relations are perpetuated through exchange in knowledge formation, but can also change. I'm not saying anything new here. Mauss' essay on the gift was published in 1924 and has inspired generations of social scientists. My point is, when we delve into those mechanisms and conditions of exchange of knowledge, including things, we also see why categories like colonial versus local cannot always be clearly recognizable, even problematic. By thinking in those categories, we risk reproducing dichotomies of colonizer versus colonized and of perpetrators versus victims without room for agency, and subsequently of post-colonial identities linked to them. And these are precisely the categories and power relations through which the colonial archive and the colonial museum were guided in their collecting urges, and about which there is now a justified worldwide call to break through those frameworks and to decolonize them. But how do you do that if you recognize that power structures in knowledge are not fixed because of that principle of exchange? Today, I explore that by taking you to a number of places and protagonists of austerity, abstination and spiritual seeking, and of alternative heritage formation in Indonesia, and along a route of unsettling and therefore insightful experiences. To the spiritual reformers and prophets of non-violence, the alternative do-gooders I've referred to as the hippies of empire. Utopian, as their reform practices are sometimes interpreted, or not, they have a heuristic value, I argue, because they can upset us, which is needful. They make physical histories that are just as much about power, difference and violence, but that also have centers of power other than those of empire, and that transcend the national. For this, I take you along to visit 4 places and objects of alternative heritage formation. A library, a mill, an ashram, and its stone Buddha head. The question is, how can they help us break free from the frameworks with which we interpret colonial and post-colonial history, help to gauge the colonial dimension of things, And why would that be necessary? I first explain the context, but first so the context. The idea of how the study of alternative knowledge production practices can provide us with insight into the political and colonial aspects of knowledge production arose during my research into the makings, reach and political effects of what I call the moral geography of Greater India, and how and why Indonesia became part of it. First is moral geography. The region, now called South and Southeast Asia, the Kasparas field of study, is worldwide in museums, academia and popular culture often presented as one superior civilization with Hindu-Buddhist characteristics and its origin in India. Followers of that idea of Greater India, from Indian nationalists to yoga aficionados across the world, often pitted against an image of Western civilization as materialistic and warmongering, ignoring Islam. Interestingly, Indonesia, with the largest Muslim population in the world, is included in this moral geography of a Hindu-Buddhist Greater India. In museums of Asian art, Indonesia is invariably seen as the recipient of this highly regarded Hindu-Buddhist civilization, and although in the British Museum, which I recently visited, change is visible, in general, in galleries of Islamic art, Indonesia is missing. Thus, in a double way, the case of Indonesia shows how epistemic violence works. I examine how and why scholarly, intellectual and spiritual knowledge networks in Asia, Europe and the US, and from theosophy to the hippie trail, have contributed to the moral geography of Greater India and closing Indonesia. This research brought me to the then 92-year-old Ananda Suyono, who passed away recently, in Solo, Central Java. He was born in that city in 1924 to an Islamic family of successful batik traders, and he attended Dutch Colonial secondary education. His parents were among the founders of the Theosophical Lodge in Solo, one of the first of such lodges, which had been rapidly formed in the Dutch East Indies since 1901. Thus, they joined a modern, global spiritual reform movement. The Theosophical Society was founded in New York in 1875 by Ukrainian-born Russian-German Helena Blavatsky and American Henry Olcott. In 1883, the association established its headquarters in Ajar, Madras in India, and Suyono followed in his parents' footsteps and searched further. He joined the Theosophical Society in 1948 when he was in Dutch captivity during the War of Independence, became a Buddhist in 1953, traveled to India, and then in Java became a guide to Sumara, a local spiritual movement that was founded in the 1930s, and that in the 1950s, also from the 1950s onwards, also attracted foreigners. Beginning in the 1970s, Suyono, in turn, as a Javanese guru, welcomed hippies and hippie researchers who sought to understand Javanese spirituality through meditation, and with them he exchanged meditation tricks and also books. Now, that unsettling experience that I was talking about, understanding the joke, sociologist Gislinde Kuipers told us, is the key to understanding difference. Little is more disconcerting than a joke that makes others laugh, but which we ourselves do not understand. This incomprehensible joke also helps cultural historians to recognize the political nature of culture. Something similar occurs when seeing rituals and customs that don't seem to fit how we think the world works, or when seeing a library. When I first visited Suyono in 2016, apart from the cat Foxy, I found a remarkably well-organized library in his house. That library was an unsettling experience for me. It consisted of popular theosophical works of the colonial era and in Dutch translation, and it went on to Canadian New Age works of the 2000s. From Blavatsky's Sacred Doctrine to Paul Brunton's Search in Secret India, from the Bhagavad-Gita's Yoga to psychedelic works from the 1970s, Carlos Castaneda, books by and about Indian gurus, from Krishnamurti to Sai Baba, academic studies on Japanese spiritual movements, Islam, and the culture of Java and Solo during Suharto's New Order. And finally, there were books on Marxism and communism, also in Dutch, Forbidden Fruits under President Suharto and still suspected in Indonesia. All those books, and the way he categorized them, show Suyono as a spiritual seeker on the road to enlightenment, self-realization. Suyono had received many books from his students from the US and Europe who had visited him in the 1970s and 1980s in search of Japanese spirituality. The whole thing was overwhelming. I soon discovered that Suyono's library was not unique. Comparable libraries with comparable book titles are found in the old theosophical lodges and Sino-Buddhist temples in Java, as well as in the Gandhi ashram of the Indonesian Ibu Gedong in Bali, where I will take you later in this lecture. These libraries show how spiritual seeking, recycling, and deconsuming are forms of knowledge production, and how, through borrowing, exchange, rearranging, and labeling, they bring together and overthrow categories that we thought were separate. At the same time, they connect global academic and alternative spiritual knowledge networks. At international conferences on the subject of knowledge formation and religion in Asia, where I showed this library, I invariably saw a smile of recognition from older and younger colleagues. They had been there, far out, as it was called in the 1970s. They had found these libraries in the backpacker hostels where they camped, from Calcutta to the Himalayas and from Bangkok to Bali. But for these colleagues, this ancient path of spiritual seekers in Asia had eventually led to academia. In that sense, we, as historians or future historians, and social scientists who are concerned with the culture, politics, and history of Asia, are not very different from the hippies who exchanged the Bhagavad-Gita in the 1970s and searched the library of the Tropical Museum in Amsterdam for books on Asian culture. Studies dating back to colonial times. In fact, we are all hippies, colonial hippies, as academics, journalists, or travelers in Asia, and it might be good to be aware of this when we are trying to understand and change the world's problems. Libraries, such as Suyono's, show us the influence of theosophy, Indian gurus, and New Age on spiritual movements in Indonesia. Those libraries are archives of alternative histories and alternative processes of knowledge formation that have not been considered in colonial and post-colonial historiography. However, they deserve to be seriously studied. First, because they create other categories unknown to us and can thereby help us break free from thinking patterns determined by national and colonial frameworks of archives and museums, and to question those frameworks. That is the meaning of such an unsettling experience that I was talking about. Secondly, these libraries make visible alternative forms of cultural imperialism for which we as scholars are jointly responsible, but which reflect not a Western-centric, but an India-centric imagination. But the question is, what do the individuals who associate with such alternative political ideas do with it? What is their scope for action? And how do Indonesian perspectives fit into this? By investing the heuristic value of the study of knowledge practices and heritage formation around the alternative movements, I make a plea for the detachment of colonial and post-colonial historiography from the frameworks and structures of archival and museum heritage formation. What can we learn from those alternative people and good Samaritans? What can we learn from their seeking, their failures and their better failures, about the way colonial societies work, about the power and impotence of knowledge and heritage formation, and the sense and nonsense of the frameworks that guide us as historians to understand the views and actions of individuals and groups, without losing sight of state structures and state institutions. The questions are also, to what extent did they fail? In the eyes of whom? For whom not? And who actually determines that? So let me return to alternative practice of heritage and knowledge production, and to the next unsettling encounter for me and my interlocutor now around food. In 2017, I spoke in Jakarta with the well-known Indonesian intellectual Aji Damen, the retired director of the Historical Museum in Jakarta, who passed away last year. Sadly. We were talking about his father, the French philologist Charles-Louis Damen, on the right here, who in the late 1930s, like his Dutch fellow student de Gasparis, whose gown I borrowed, would start working for the Oudheidkundige Dienst, or the Archaeological Service of the Dutch East Indies. Charles-Louis stayed because during the Japanese occupation, he married Aji's mother, Radharowo Suyatung Puspokusumo. My question about his father's spiritual theosophical quest evoked a specific memory in his son, Aji. In the picture, it's the laughing boy on the left, and we see another library and another cat. Like the novelist Marcel Proust, tasting a Madeleine cake, which famously plunged him into memories of his French elite past, Aji Damen was able to evoke an ancient theosophical world through a dish, the meaning of which he did not realize at the time. Biefstuk Theosophie. Actually, it's Biefstuk Theosoph. In the 1950s, the Damen father and son often came to Solo for Charles-Louis' philological and epigraphic research. There, they invariably visited the restaurant Pak Ahmad, named after the owner. On the menu was, you guessed it, Biefstuk Theosoph. The name fascinated Aji immensely as a little boy, and he kept asking his father about it. But now, in 2017, he summed it up by saying, yeah, that was of course the vegetarian dish. At a time when the term vegetarian meatball has become commonplace, we may no longer be surprised by the combination vegetarian and steak, But still, they also struck me as a remarkable remnant, heritage, of theosophical knowledge networks going back to colonial times. However, the dish, biefstuk theosoof, which would adorn Pak Ahmad's menu until at least the late 1960s, did not seem to fit into the framework in which little Departemen was familiar with eating and interpreting his world of the 1950s, and also not in mine now. What that implied, how insightful the name of the dish could be for understanding alternative learning in Indonesia, I only realized when, a year later, two elderly Indonesian theosophists in Surabaya wanted to take me out to dinner to the vegetarian restaurant further in town. I had just spoken to them for hours in the languaging but still functioning Theosophical Lodge. I was honored by the vegetarian invitation, but it was late and dark. The trip to the vegetarian restaurant was an hour's ride on the back of a motorbike without helmet. I saw the little square in front of opposite the Theosophical Lodge, full of warung, where the most delicious vegetarian dishes beckoned. Why not a gado-gado or tempeh with delicious sayur lodeh and rice, I suggested. But no, my host emphasized, that was different. If we were going to eat vegetarian, we were supposed to do it in the vegetarian restaurant. Now, the vegetarianism that struck me in Solo and Surabaya didn't seem to fit in the frameworks I was familiar with myself. Apart from that, there are, of course, also other reasons and frameworks to consider why vegetarianism in Indonesia seems difficult to place. Religious frameworks. Pork, yes, but most meat and fish are not taboo in Indonesian Islam. Hindus in Bali, if they can afford it, eat their babi guling with relish, and fish is no problem either. The more important framework is economic inequality. People still suffer from food insecurity and malnutrition in Indonesia. Anyway, the two men in Surabaya drew a line for themselves that I didn't understand. But that makes it all the more interesting for the researcher. The point is, the challenge is not to fit that strange into the frameworks we already know, but to make understandable why that strange is not strange from the perspective of the other. These vegetarian encounters also show how memories and different academic, alternative and local forms of knowledge come together and blur the boundaries between what could be local and colonial, or academic and alternative. They reflect structures of power that influence practices of knowledge production, in which, for one, the less educated, not wealthy chairman of the languishing Theosophical Lodge in Surabaya, vegetarianism means status, but is also born out of necessity, while the Indonesian hipster in Jakarta eats vegan spaghetti because she can. What is local here? What is colonial about it? And what does Theosophical stake actually offer an alternative for in colonial and post-colonial Indonesia? I will take you further into the world of the spiritually oriented social prophets in colonial and post-colonial Indonesia, which was not limited to that of Theosophy. On to the ashram and another unsettling experience. For my research, I stayed several times in the ashram Gandhi in Chandidasa on the east coast of Bali. There, I took part in the fixed vegetarian meals 3 times a day. Before each meal was a prayer in which we chanted mantras from the Bhagavad-Gita in Sanskrit. The Bhagavad-Gita is a famous episode from the Indian epic Mahabharata about the existential dilemmas of Arjuna in conversation with Krishna, which is waged on the eve of the great war of Arjuna and his brothers against their cousins. The Bhagavad-Gita, through various translations, including those by theosophists in the late 1880s, became a modern Bible not only for Indian nationalists, but also for European and American seekers, spiritual seekers. It was a guide both for and against violent action. In the ashram in Bali, I could place the vegetarian meal, but that prayer in Sanskrit was more complicated. Especially when it turned out that the permanent residents, Balinese from Karangasem, during the evening prayers also recited from other sacred texts, including the Quran and the Bible. What we shared, none of us has mastered Sanskrit. So what was this about? And what was local, Balinese, Indian, or perhaps colonial about it? We follow Ni Wayangadong, who is known here as Ibu Budong, the founder of the Ashram Gandhi. In 1953, then a 32-year-old Balinese teacher, Ibu Budong Bagus Oka traveled to India to fulfill a dream, to visit the famous ashram founded by Mahatma Gandhi in Sejarah, Gujarat. There she met Vinoba Bhave, regarded as the spiritual successor of Gandhi, who was assassinated in 1948. Bhave would become her great inspiration. Gandhi's ashram as an idea, Gandhi's pursuit of satyagraha, in short, truth, attainable through non-violence and courage, and Gandhi's Bible, the Bhagavad-Gita, are said to have guided Ibu Budong in her post-war spiritual and social-political activism. Gedong, now an English teacher at Udayana University in Denpasar, set up several projects to spread Gandhi's values of non-violence in Indonesia, including her translation of Gandhi's autobiography and the establishment of the ashram in Chandidasa. She did this in the wake of the anti-communist violence of 1965-1966, and while President Suharto's new order continued to work through repression. In her ashram, Ibu Budong had pictures of Gandhi and of Swami Vivekananda watching over her shoulders, hosted foreigners, tourists come spiritual seekers, scholars and old friends as well, Dutch and Indonesian friends. And she oversaw the character building of her students with her adaptation of Gandhi's principles: Swadeshi, self-sufficiency, ahimsa, non-violence and service to others, and satya, truth. Condensed in the mantras prayer, meditation, discipline and simplicity, and daily yoga. For, as she quoted the Bhagavad-Gita, where there is no meditation, there is no peace. Where there is no peace, there can be no happiness. Ni Wayangadong, her maiden name, was the first Balinese girl to attend a Dutch language primary school in Bali. In 1936, she traveled alone to the Algemene Middelbare School, the General Secondary School, or the AMS, in Yogyakarta, lodged with a family of a spiritually inclined Christian Reformed pastor there, attended services at his church, and, she says, was touched forever by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, coincidentally just like Gandhi. The AMS had a special curriculum focused on the history of Eastern civilization, as it was then known, which began in ancient India and was developed by the archaeologist Willem F. Stutterheim. In 1939, as the director of the Dutch Colonial Archaeological Service in Batavia, Stutterheim appointed de Gasparis, the one of my toga, and Damen, of the Theosophical stake to work for the service. His AMS introduced students to texts such as the Bhagavad-Gita, first translated into Indonesian by one of the students and Sumatran Amir Hamza, a later poet, who based his translation on a Dutch translation by Dutch theosophist and Indologist Boisvin, which in turn was based on an English copy. Gedong may have read one of those two versions, but it might just as well have been Gandhi's own translation itself that brought Gedong into the Gita, where Gandhi, in turn, was inspired by his theosophical friends in London to read and comprehend the Bhagavad-Gita. After graduated from Christian Quake School, or the Christian School for School Teachers in Batavia, Gedong returned to Bali and during the revolution befriended a Dutch Gandhiist, wife of the critical administrative official Siebe Lijftocht, who supported the independence movement. Linda Lijftocht, his wife, Gedong's friend, gave Gedong access to her library, lent her books, that's our theme again, and inspired Gedong to follow Gandhi's vegetarian diet. Gandhi, in his turn, had rediscovered the path to vegetarianism, not through his Indian education, but through his friendship with vegetarians, radical vegetarians, and theosophists in the London of his student days. The interrelated questions are: what is the alternative, and what is colonial about the knowledge production practices that converge in Ibu Gedong's ashram? And what role do power and inequality play in this? The knowledge networks in which Ibu Gedong participated expose histories that remain out of sight of national political historiography. They reflect colonial experience, desires to be part of a larger, transnational spiritual solidarity movement, and reform ideals that transcend the national and which from the outside look purely spiritual, but are also politically charged. Individuals in these networks of knowledge participated in forms of cultural imperialism in which the idea of a superior Indian culture is the gauge, and that included Indonesia in a moral geography of Greater India. Ibu Gedong's quest for knowledge and enlightenment makes clear how difficult it is to determine what is local, colonial, or Indian. Her search also makes it clear that following the local perspective is not necessarily the answer to the question of how to detach history from its colonial frameworks. This brings me to the last part of my lecture, a final example, a final unsettling experience. I'm going to take some water. It is 1947. One day in Amsterdam, a stone Buddha head lies in the back of a car. It is not welcome in the house of the owner, a banker, who has just bought the head from a private merchant. The lady of the house believes there is a curse on it, speaking of the burden of colonial things. A few days later, the banker donated the stone Buddha head to the Vereniging Vrienden van Aziatische Kunst, or the Association of Friends of Asian Art, founded in 1918, which would have its collection managed by the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam from 1952. Until recently, the Buddha head has been on display there in the permanent exhibition as Asian Art, overlooking the space as pictured here in 2018. This Buddha head has a long history of robbery and exchange, valuations and transactions. And this set of transactions is what we call the social biography of an object, and what makes that biography political. The social biography of this Buddha head begins on one of the 504 Buddha statues of Borobudur, the temple in central Java, built around 800 by the subjects of the Sailendra kingdom. Of those 504 statues from the original temple, 43 are missing and more than 300 have been damaged, 250 of which have been decapitated. You see the Buddha head here, hewn from granite and with the characteristics that art historians identify for every Buddha head in the world. The bun and the dot on the forehead are outward symbols of inner perfection. The ears, elongated by the earrings that the Buddha originally wore as a prince, testify that he has renounced all worldly things, renouncing the worldly. So this object also fits in the theme of my argument. The Association of Friends of Asian Art and the Rijksmuseum are following this renounced line by now mainly showing the artistic and the spiritual in their display, as if the violence in this head's biography does not matter. The Buddha head in the Rijksmuseum shares the same fate with at least 180 Borobudur heads, which are scattered across museums and private collections worldwide. When the curator of the Rijksmuseum, Jan Fontijn, came to collect the Buddha head from the banker in 1947, he made no effort to ask further about the story about this head, let alone what we would now call its provenance. He just became part of a long tradition which, as we now also see with donations to museums, is still maintained. Despite the debate about decolonization and the restitution of collections, and despite provenance research, such as that of the remarkable pilot project Provenance Research on Objects of the Colonial Era, PROCHE, which took place in the past 2 years and was presented this year. But that this question of origin was not asked can be explained by greed. Greed under the guise of love and scientific curiosity or academic curiosity. My question now, why is the story of the curse and the trunk not in the Asian Art Museum, and the story of the artist gifted by divine creativity is? Why are such ghost stories which haunt and are well known in the museum world not taken seriously and shown in the exhibition hall? For the subject, this story matters. It is a phase in the social biography of this object. The object and this story deserve to be taken seriously because they can help us move beyond the boundaries of art history. This story shows us that in the heart of Amsterdam there was someone who thought that a curse rested on his Buddha head and that it could be related to violence. Here, physical violence, temple looting, and epistemic violence, appropriation and attribution of meaning at the expense of other meanings, developed in mechanisms of power and exchange. So let's return to those mechanisms of exchange with which I started this lecture. What do these mean for the question of the provenance of museum objects and the demand for restitution or repatriation, which is just another step in the politics of heritage formation? Provenance, in a limited sense of origin, is not necessarily the most interesting aspect of the social biography of a museum object. The question of origin, due to the totality of transactions, exchange, and signification that the object has gone through, is moreover not the same as asking who is the rightful owner. For many objects, it is uncertain who they should be with, and the answer to that question is always political. But for some, it is immediately clear where they should be. Buddha heads like this one are an example of this. They belong on the statues of the more than 1100-year-old Buddhist temple in Java. But in Indonesia, Borobudur has in turn become part of national and international heritage politics, and also changed as a result of global and local religious revivalist signification. Yet the Borobudur Buddha heads that are now in museums and private collections could have continued to play a role there, in local religious practices, memory formation, and a changing meaning of the place. It is painful that they could not do that they have been taken away in the context of colonial power structures, economic gain, and greater Indian thought, and have been disappearing into showcases as spiritual Asian art and deposed of museums, or are traded in the art market at ever-increasing prices, can be regarded as injustice and as epistemic violence. That's not necessarily a new idea, but it deserves to be studied more seriously, but not to take the one-dimensional story of colonial oppressors versus oppressed as a guideline for how we try to understand history. Then we miss alternative perspectives. Finally, to end, that burden of colonial things will, or at least in the Netherlands, will never get over it. Nor am I advocating that we try. Quite the contrary. What I wanted to show is how the things, the gone of the Gaspares, the libraries of Ananda Suyono and Ibu Gedong, the vegetarian dish in Surabaya and Solo, the ashram and the Bhagavad-Gita in Bali, and the Buddha head in Amsterdam, how things carry a colonial weight and histories of epistemic violence. That such things are also enriching because people always assign meaning to them. That they involve various different forms of knowledge and can tell various different stories than those of Western colonialism or art history with a capital A. Stories that are equally about violence, power and exclusion, but have different centers of power, transcending the national, such as the moral geography of Greater India. It becomes difficult to recognize, listen to, and investigate those stories if we continue to rely on the conventional frameworks, categorization, and places of preservation of knowledge, the museums, the archives, and the academic libraries, the academic Asian libraries. It is therefore worthwhile to include the objects and places of alternative heritage formation, spirituality and austerity in our analysis of political culture and history. We must dare to step outside those conventional frameworks so that we learn to listen to alternative histories, so that they can unsettle us or unsettle our thoughts about what makes low knowledge colonial and about how history works, and show what our own role in knowledge production is and does. Because knowledge production is always political, so that places and objects can tell the social political histories they contain, so that we can learn from those places and objects and see and understand the wider worlds outside the framework of heritage institutions. By taking these alternative seekers as a guideline, I hope to contribute to this with my chair, with research into the politics and exchange of knowledge in transnational reform movements in an intercolonial and inter-Asian Asiatic context. It will be about histories of vegetarianism, austerity, and ecological practices and thinking, of hippiedom and Orientalism, but also of police and spirituality in late colonial and post-colonial times. And invariably it is about the forms, role and politics of knowledge formation in this, and how they exert influence now in local and transnational contexts. I hope to continue to do so in the mutual inspiration I've already experienced with my students, with the students here, and with the colleagues here and in the Netherlands and elsewhere in the world, in search of stories that can unsettle us. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marika, for the inspiring lecture and several important points that set of answers. Yeah. And saya kira semua tadi mendengar dan semoga teman-teman semua masih tune in ya. I'm not going to summarize, but perhaps it's a bad idea to have some points to highlight. Mari mengangkat topik beban dari peninggalan kolonial. Jadi kurang lebih colonial things. Dan dia tidak memakai kata colonial past, tetapi things. Mengapa? Karena segala sesuatunya masih terbawa sampai sekarang dan sering tidak disadari. Jadi kolonialisme meninggalkan warisan benda maupun non-benda, dan sejauh mana kita memproduksi pengetahuan mengenai masa lalu ini masih dipengaruhi oleh cara berpikir kolonial. Kira-kira mari memulai dengan pertanyaan seperti itu, dan dia memfokuskan orasinya pada beberapa aspek, misalnya soal koleksi di dalam museum, koleksi di dalam perpustakaan. Bagaimana mungkin dalam library corner di sebuah perpustakaan mengenai Islam itu tidak ada Indonesia, ya. Kira-kira seperti itu. Bagaimana produksi mengenai Indonesia dan dalam konteks Islam misalnya muncul di dalam kasanah pengetahuan kolonial, di dalam pengetahuan global. Kemudian tentang buku, beberapa buku tadi disajikan, kemudian tentang kulineri, tentang makanan misalnya. Bagaimana produksi makanan sebenarnya mencerminkan, membawa beban masa lalu kolonial, dan seterusnya. Lalu beberapa individu ditampilkan, mereka yang masih menggeluti pemikiran dan warisan itu dan mencoba menghadirkan pengetahuan yang baru. Lalu di akhir paparannya, mari mengangkat kembali mengenai pendekatan terhadap kajian ini tentang warisan kolonial, tentang produksi pengetahuan di dalam konteks yang lebih sekarang. Bagaimana kita tidak terjebak pada paradigma kolonial, tetapi mencari pendekatan alternatif terhadap itu. Dan saya kira, I think all the aspects here are very relevant to reflect on the Indonesian history, in particular in the historiography of Indonesia, whether we have actually invented a new approach to study Indonesian history, and in how far Indonesian historiography is still dependent on actually a colonial framework of seeing and signifying, giving meanings to the heritage, colonial heritage, and also colonial knowledge production. And this is a true challenge, but in the end, Professor Bluethen invites us for more questions and also perhaps discussions in this aspect. Jadi saya kira Bapak Ibu di Jogja, di UGM maupun di berbagai tempat yang join kita online mungkin sudah ada pertanyaan. Mengundang saya di forum ini di Ruang Sugondo melihat satu tangan terangkat. Apakah dari teman-teman yang ada di Zoom ada yang raise hands ya? Mohon raise hands, nanti oleh admin kami akan respond. Ya, anybody who have the questions, please raise hands. Pertanyaan, questions can be in Indonesian or in English. Ya, nanti akan ditanya secara langsung. If you are hesitant to ask your questions directly live, you can have it on chat, the chat. Okay, just type it. Saya akan mulai dari yang tadi sudah mengangkat tangan. Di sini ada satu, saya lihat. Ada yang lain, di belakang ada satu, ada dua dulu ditahan. Dari layar ada yang mengangkat, dari mana? Dari UNAS atau Andalas atau Halu Oleo, dari UIN Kalijaga atau Untirta, ya. Secara spesifik, ya. WNJ sudah raise hands. Oke, WNJ ada satu ya. Ada lagi yang lain? Jadi saya kira teman-teman di UIN in particular, Untirta ada. Oke, kita mulai dulu dari yang di ruangan ini di Gedung Sugondo. Saya tadi melihat ada satu, mohon bantuan. Ini mikrofon ada di depan. One of you, yes. Jadi Pak Kader sekaligus menjadi pengejar acara ya. Mungkin ada teman yang bisa membantu ini salah satu. One of you please. Ya, Oke, makasih. Tolong sebutkan nama ya. Just mention your name and yes.
Okay, check. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for the knowledge about library, the theoretical, and so on. First of all, I will introduce myself. My name is Untitled Chapter, and I'm from year 2022. Apologies in advance if there is unclear pronunciation, because I'm still a beginner in learning English language and can understand English statement quickly. I'm sorry if my question out of the box, but it has something to do with colonialism. My question is regarding about how the moral burden borne by the Dutch from the colonialism carried out by him, and of course harming the Indonesian nation, like the colonial taxation which the Dutch exploited through tax instrument and so on. Thank you, Prof. Mariet.
Get the question. Can you get the question?
Ya, ekonomi. Terima kasih banyak. Maaf, saya tidak bisa dengar suara kurang jelas.
Sebelumnya mohon maaf.
Mungkin bicara lebih karena dalam.
Ya, saya mulainya memakai bahasa Indonesia mungkin agar lebih jelas. Sebelumnya terima kasih juga atas pengetahuannya tentang 4 poin-poin tadi. Sebelumnya perkenalkan, saya Anissa Dini Kamila, angkatan tahun 2022. Yang akan saya tanyakan adalah sebenarnya agak out of the box dari materi tadi terkait ini beban moral dari bahasa Belanda. Seperti yang kita tahu pada zaman kolonial dulu dan pada zaman-zaman dahulu pastinya banyak dari bangsa Belanda yang menjajah bangsa Indonesia, dan juga adanya suatu penjajahan yang menderitakan bangsa Indonesia, seperti adanya instrumen pajak, terus juga adanya sistem tanam paksa dan sebagainya. Nah, pada euforia kemerdekaan sekarang ini, saya ingin mengetahui terkait bagaimana sih sebenarnya beban moral yang dihadapi oleh bangsa Belanda terhadap hal-hal seperti ini di zaman dahulu, dan juga tentunya adanya relevansi di zaman kontemporer seperti ini. Terima kasih.
Second questions from the room. I saw someone raising hands. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I think that was really great. I think mysticism and spirituality is such a big part of Indonesia's history. Like we see that in Bhagavad-Gita or other wars, how spirituality and mysticism plays a part in that. But I think one of the biggest obstacles of incorporating that into history writing is methods and verification. I think verification is big in history, and so I'm just wondering, are you advocating for a multidisciplinary approach, for example through religious studies and anthropology? So what kind of methods do you have in mind to carry out this goal? As well as, do you have resources or researchers who you think have done a great job in terms of using alternative sources that you can maybe share with us? Thank you.
you would like to answer to the first two questions? Or there is still one hand on the... Yeah? Okay. Let's take the third questions, then Marika will answer to that, yeah? But I haven't taken your name. I'm sorry.
Nessa.
Anessa.
Nessa.
Nessa, okay, thank you Nessa. Now, sekarang dari room ini ada dua ya, dari UNY. Silakan UNY. Suaranya yang keras. Suaranya yang keras di sini. Berdiri boleh, berdiri, iya. Namanya ya, Mas, silakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
My name is from History Education UNY 2021. I speak for my broken Netherlands. If the presentatie Van Madam Gundagen. My question is from the presentation before. Pertanyaan saya terhadap presentasi yang Madam Gundagen sudah sampaikan. History of colonialism, sejarah kolonial, could not be separated from whether both part. From both nations, Indonesia and Netherlands. So my point, why our history sometimes, kenapa sejarah kita kadang being simplified, being blunted, being biased around the perspective of both nations. The first question. Two, what's the clear solution about that divided issue of history or perspective or Indonesian and Netherlands of colonialism and post-colonialism history? Thank you. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Terima kasih. Tadi namanya siapa, Mas? Namanya siapa tadi?
Pacaroman.
Siapa?
Muhammad Pacaroman Hasmito.
Fajar. Fajar. Oke, Mas Fajar dari Prodi Ilmu Sejarah UNY ya. Mas Fajar Fajar. Oke, yes, why is history sometimes being biased or influenced by such perspective? Yeah, colonial, post-colonial, Indonesia. Okay, one more question before Professor Bluderton will answer your questions. Okay, this is now from Sultan Agung Tirtayasa in Banten. Betul, ini yang sudah ditayang di layar adalah Tirtayasa Banten. Is it right? Yeah, please ask your questions clearly. Mention your name, please. Mana ini yang bertanya, boleh berdiri?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Nama saya Putri Muhammadiyadila dari perwakilan Universitas Utara Adat Makassar. Sebelumnya terima kasih atas kesempatannya kepada Bapak Agus. Dan di sini saya mohon izin untuk menggunakan bahasa Indonesia. Pertanyaannya, apakah para tokoh Indonesia yang melakukan pencerahan melalui karya pengetahuan di belahan baik Eropa maupun Asia akan tetap kita terapkan di masa-masa yang akan datang, serta nilai spirit.
Suaranya hilang.
Apa dari tokoh Hussein Jayadiningrat, yaitu tokoh dari Aceh sendiri dan ambil mengapa tokoh Hussein Jayadiningrat.
Oke. Tadi terputus suaranya. Mengapa tokoh-tokoh yang tercerahkan apa tadi terputus?
Mohon bagus dari yang dapat.
Oke, ditangkap ya. Mengapa tokoh-tokoh yang tercerahkan, ya, apakah akan tetap jadi sumber pencerahan, kira-kira gitu ya? Tadi ada dua tokoh yang bagus dari Bali dan juga Sejarah di Lingkar. Ya, kira-kira. Baik, nanti kita ambil poinnya saja. Baik, Marika, so you have already 4 questions. Was from Angela on the moral burdens of colonial things. How to deal with it? For example, on the history of taxation in the Netherlands Indies. And second is from Nessa on on how to invent alternative approaches in studying archives and history. And from Mas Fajar, that is from State University of Yogyakarta, where history sometimes being biased and influenced by such a dichotomic perspective on colonial, post-colonial, and Indonesian and Dutch approaches and so on and so on. And the last question is from Banten. Our friend from Banten is raising questions whether those enlightened persons in history will, as long as I understand, will continue to become as inspired and also enlightened sources for of inspirations for the present day history, understanding history, writing, history constructions. And you have a lot of questions here, and I hope well you can shed some light on it. Okay, please.
Thank you, terima kasih banyak. Ini pertanyaan yang bagus dan menarik sekali. I might combine some of them, but let me first just do it in the order they were raised. So first there's this question about the moral burden of colonial things, how to deal with it so in the framework of my talk, it depends a bit. So I was really talking about material things, so the garden, a library, a dish, an ashram and a Buddha head. And I think the point is that all of them actually have a colonial burden, have a colonial dimension, all of them, but you don't see it immediately. But my other point was also that even though it is a clear-cut colonial object, people always also give other meanings to it, and that it should be our task to integrate these. So if I would translate that to how to deal with museum objects and their colonial dimension, for example in the Rijksmuseum or the Museum Nationaal, it's good to show how they have a colonial history because of their collecting histories, because they have been stolen or gifted, or to integrate that in the story of the exhibition. But there are also other stories that also relate to colonial history. The banker's wife who thought there was a curse on the Buddha head, she was an Indo, a Dutch Indo. She was also formed by a colonial history. So if your question is about how to deal with that as an historian, it is always good to be aware of it and to question it, and you can see how it continues to work both in the West and in formerly colonized countries. But there's always more to that. And if we don't seek for that, we will always remain in these clear-cut frameworks which are related to the history of modern history. So I think in the course of the other answers, I think I also will address the first question. So that brings me immediately to the second question. So indeed, how to research this? Well, I am actually interdisciplinary formed. So I think from my background writing my PhD in the social sciences, that's actually where I got to understand how and why culture is always political. So it's always good to be inspired by theoretical thinking and studies from other disciplines to see how we can deal with the official archives. But my other part of my story is indeed to also, it seems as if in the larger public, when people think of the archive, it is always the National Archive. But there are so many other places and sites where people gather knowledge and form libraries or form collections. And if you start looking for that, then you get, in a way, easier outside of these frameworks than when you start in the National Archive. But I'm not saying that it is not possible to find these alternative perspectives when studying sources in the archive. There are these methods of reading against the grain, indirectly seeking for local perspectives. But I think part of my point is that it is not only the National Archive where we can seek. And yeah, indeed, I chose this topic also because it seems as if in historiography it has never been taken seriously because the spiritual seekers last out in history. But is it really the case? And I think we really miss something if we don't explore that perspective further. It is, if you see it in that way, it is always a winner's perspective on history. So, yeah, the method is also about listening seriously. There are still theosophists, and they are still engaging with ideals that have transformed, but relating to a colonial past as well. Yeah, so I think this partly already gives an answer to Fatja's question. How come that it is so difficult to remain in this dichotomy of colonizers versus colonized? Well, that has something to do with the established institutions where historians are trained to first do their research, as well as the museums. These are all institutions that were formed in the 19th century and shaped by certain frameworks, state-centered frameworks, institution-centered frameworks, white colonial views. And then there is, on the other side of the story, the anti-colonial Indonesian nationalist story, which is going against it, but operating from the same framework. So it is actually all more complex. And one good example of one way of researching this actually is also to seriously start studying family histories. For example, the family of Departemen, which shows a much more complicated history. Departemen has been formed by a father who is an outsider inside, but also representing a colonial institution, and an Indonesian mother who was anti-colonial but there was also an engagement with French culture. Departemen became a very important critical intellectual in post-colonial Indonesia, but there is this, his family has also connections to colonial history. And if you go to Jaya Diningrat, to the fourth question. But so he's a very interesting figure because as an Indonesian, there is no other Indonesian who got so high within the colonial hierarchy. He ended up as the director of education and religion because he didn't get a position of the chair of the Volksraad, the People's Council. But he was a professor in Indonesia. He became the chair of the Java Institute. He was extremely wanted by Dutch intellectuals. They were dependent of his knowledge. He accompanied people from the archaeological service to Aceh. So it's really incredible. But then in post-colonial Indonesia, it was difficult because of this notion of collaboration or with the Dutch, or working for the Dutch colonial administration. But in the end, under I think in 2004 or something, he was together with Mohammed Gunawan. He got a nomination posthumously of being a pelopor kebudayaan. Together with Mohammed Gunawan, Dan Professor Soetmoter, who was also Dutch. So there is this Jaya Ringot shows how figures like he are also complicated in Indonesian post-colonial history, causing some uncomfortness, and at the same time he is very much appreciated. And the other way around, in the Netherlands, Leiden University can be proud of producing the first Indonesian PhD student, but this was really in a very colonial, in an unequal setting. Yeah, and there's much more. The whole Jaya Ringot family is interesting because within the family you have people who worked for the colonial administration, but also who were very much against, like his niece. Anyhow, so within Indonesian families you see that it's not a one-sided story of Indonesians against a Dutch colonial administration or collaborators.
Yes, oke. Jadi poinnya kira-kira kompleks ya, realitasnya kompleks bahwa dalam satu warisan itu tidak bisa ada sejumlah hal sekaligus, jadi tidak bisa dilihat di dalam satu perspektif saja. Ya, misalnya ini Belanda atau Indonesia, gitu ya, tidak bisa. Atau ini Jawa atau Banten misalnya. Ada kompleksitas realitas yang harus nanti didekati, dimaknai, dibaca ulang dengan sumber-sumber yang lebih beragam. Nah, itu menimbulkan pertanyaan baru mengenai bagaimana konstruksi mengenai warisan ini akan dilakukan, gitu ya, mengenai itu. Kita di layar sudah melihat sejumlah tangan diangkat, dan ini there are more questions on the screen here. We are delighted to invite our colleagues from Halu Uleo University in Kendari. First of all, Kendari, please. Kendari, tolong disyarat, please put on the screen. Yes, Kendari, please mention your name and your questions briefly. If you are hesitant to speak in English, just use Indonesian, and that doesn't matter. Please. Kendari, Halu Uleo Kendari yang sudah mengangkat tangan, dan saya persilakan untuk pertama pada termin kedua ini. Kendari. Ya, video bisa on, Pak, mohon maaf. Ya, oke, silakan. Siapa namanya dan apa pertanyaannya?
Terima kasih kesempatan radio bertanya kepada saya, dan terima kasih juga kepada materi yang telah memaparkan materi yang begitu bagus. Perkenalkan, nama saya Malik, perwakilan dari Universitas Colonial, jurusan Ilmu Sejarah. kita ketahui sebagai yang saya tidak ketahui bahwa pada masa kolonial banyak kebijakan politik seperti Bulldogs del sel. Pertanyaan saya, jelaskan hal-hal yang kemudian bisa menjadi solusi atau alternatif terhadap beban kolonial melalui produksi pengetahuan dalam perspektif Indonesia.
Mas Malik, jadi pertanyaannya adalah bagaimana perspektif Indonesia untuk produksi pengetahuan atas segmen tertentu di dalam sejarah itu ya, misalnya tanam paksa, kalau di tanam paksa seperti itu atau apa? Ya, oke, on Indonesian perspective, how to defend Indonesian perspective on this particular segment in Indonesian history, on several different styles of the Indonesian perspective. Very difficult question. Oke, berikutnya saya persilakan. Next will be for Hasanuddin, University Makassar. Oke, Makassar, monitor, saya persilakan. I saw someone raising hands from Makassar. Yes, please mention your name and say your questions. Yes. Maju sedikit. Oke. Silakan. Namanya siapa Mbak dan sebutkan secara singkat pertanyaan. Silakan.
First of all, let me introduce myself as my name is Colonial from Department of Historical at Colonial University. And thank you for the interesting subject. It reminds me about mimicry theory from Mimikri Baba. If we're talking about colonial and post-colonial, always relate with ethnic and cultural heritage of cultural exchange, but as a subject of colonialism, in other side, we always took all the value negatively, because the pride of our history may explain how we relate with our subject today. Thank you.
Okay, Mbak Amelia. Okay, thank you for the questions. If I get it right, then your question is what is it about again? Could you please repeat it? Repeat it, yeah, slowly, please.
Thanks you for the good subject. It reminds me of great theory for holiday. Baba, if we're talking about colonial, post-colonial, always relate with ethnic and cultural heritage of cultural exchange. But as a subject of colonialism in other side, we always took all the value negatively, because the friend of our history may explain how we really relate with our subject today.
Okay, thank you. The cultural exchange, how does it relate to our subject? Yes, thank you. Mbak Amelia has raised very difficult questions here. How cultural exchange has relations or has has influenced the construction of subjectivity today, and how we understand ourselves. Okay, that's very difficult questions, but Professor Marika Brubaker will try to answer that later. Okay. Next is from State University of Malang in Malang. I would like to invite you here to raise questions. Yes, Malang. Ya, silakan sebutkan nama dan sampaikan. Suaranya belum terdengar. Suaranya. Suara belum terdengar. Suara belum terdengar. Maaf, ada kendala teknis di ruangan Sugondo. Tadi saya hanya menangkap terakhir. Apakah Ki Hajar Dewantara apa? Pertanyaannya tadi. Mohon maaf, ini ada di ruangan kami sama sekali tidak terdengar. Mohon diulangi ya Pak, mohon maaf. Ya, dari awal, karena dari ruangan di Jogja sama sekali tidak terdengar ya, khususnya di ruangan Sugondo ini. Silakan. Sudah, oke, silakan diulangi saja.
Toko ini sangat terkenal bahkan waktu kami SD hanya toko ini yang sering muncul begini. Seperti yang kita tahu, setelah Hajar Dewantara ini tulisannya mengenai perayaan kemerdekaan muncul, Hajar Dewantara ini dibuang ke Belanda. Namun ketika dibuang, tidak semata-mata di sana hanya dibangun Hajar Dewantara ini belajar di sana. Dan kemudian setelah kembali ke Hindia Belanda itu, Hajar Dewantara mendirikan perkumpulan Sasakiwan yang kemudian lebih dikonkretkan menjadi taman siswa. Nah, pertanyaannya, apakah Hajar Dewantara ini juga terpengaruh dengan filosofi?
So after you publish the article on the Israelis asked to grant the class, then he was excited to the Netherlands. But then it was like an exciting study, some Western knowledge, education, some other places. And then we returned to Indonesia and then he established the Taman Siswa. The question that his friend from Malang says is whether the Hajar side was influenced much by the philosophical inspirations and how much it was combined with Western knowledge by methods. And I think more or less like the questions. Okay, sudah ada 3 and there are two more questions here from State University of Yogyakarta and also from Banten again, but we'll take these 2 questions later if time will allow us. So please monitor 3 questions will be raised and let me repeat it shortly. First is from Malik in Kendari on the Indonesian perspective of knowledge productions about colonial history and heritage. About cultural culture styles and so on. This is a segment in history. And the second question is from Amelia in Makassar on the cultural exchange and how it contributes to the shape of maybe subjectively meaning, as long as I understand how it shapes the, well, maybe identity, collective identity, and this kind of things. The last question is from Malang on Jajariwantoro and the ideas he brought back to Java after the exile in the Netherlands, and how the combinations of Western and Eastern knowledge they acquired has shaped the then Taman Siswa education system. And, yes.
Is it on? Ya, is on, ya. Terima kasih banyak. Lagi beberapa pertanyaan yang pantai sulit. Tapi ya saya lihat good questions. I think I'm going to answer them in a different order. I start with Ki Hajjadiwantoro. He is indeed a very good example of an Indonesian who was very much in the center of these alternative knowledge networks, which included important groups who were thinking about alternative forms of education, which were more directed towards the child and less authoritarian. So he developed, I'm talking about Maria Montessori and well, of course, Tabor and his Santinikitan school. So he is part of a global movement that thought of alternative forms of forming a child into an independent thinking orang dewasa. So yeah, I could have chosen him as an example as well. And if I would have done that, I would have started from a Taman Siswa school in, for example, in Jogja or anywhere, but that goes back to the colonial times. And that brings me to Mas Malik's question, so the first question of the three, on if I understand well, how to gain insight into Indonesian perspectives in the politics of heritage. And I'm very fond of this, method which I developed together with Martijn Eikhoff, a site-centered perspective. That of course, you have to go to the archives, especially when you study the cultuurstelsel, but you can also go to the site and start exploring signs of changes, interventions in that site that tell you something about how it changed, how it transformed, and which role Indonesians have played in that. I'm not sure if I should develop this further, but this could be done also for the cultuurstelsel. You can go to the region where it was managed, regions, to old sites, and see if you can trace histories back through family histories who worked on the lands. So that is really from a perspective of post-colonial studies and heritage formation. So it is, yeah, but I'm not sure if I got that question very well. Is it answered, I mean. But the final, yeah, so the question on cultural exchange is a very good question. And I think that would be actually the topic of a PhD thesis or something, where you can exactly choose this topic, and it can be on heritage formation, but it can also be on performing arts or on seni rupa or schools, actually everything that has formed by the exchange of ideas of how to do this properly, actually also in cultuurstelsel, but this is not really my field of research. And it would be great if you then can show more insight in the exchange of ideas on education, or say between Indonesians and their teachers, and how Indonesians are teachers themselves as well. But then indeed it's really an important question, how do certain ideas about culture become dominant, even though there is exchange. So yeah, it's a challenge, and you could maybe also do that in small scale in an MA thesis. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Marika. Saya kira secara singkat Ibu Marika menyampaikan bahwa sekali lagi ini gagasan yang mungkin tidak bisa diidentifikasi secara terpisah, tetapi harus dilihat sebagai satu kesatuan, dan proses produksi pengetahuan mengenai warisan kolonial harus dilakukan dengan perspektif yang terintegrasi. Kira-kira itu. Nah, seperti apa perspektif terintegrasi? Itu ada tantangan yang harus kita temukan, dan penulisan sejarah baru di dalam konteks ini atau pendekatan baru penulisan sejarah perlu memperhatikan itu. Dan tadi dua pertanyaan saya kira dari Mbak Amelia di Makassar dan dari teman kita di Malang, ini bisa diintegrasikan menjadi satu pertanyaan yang penting, tetapi saya kira jawabannya membutuhkan riset di tingkat doktoral yang cukup mendalam. Kira-kira gitu ya. Ini pertanyaan yang sulit menyangkut cultural aspek. Yes, please.
Sejarah Departemen is an interesting figure also to explain how certain this question about subjectivity, but also how to follow the Indonesian perspective. Because in Indonesia, Departemen is a national hero as an anti-colonial nationalist. But we know less about how he moved in his global transnational alternative movement. So methodologically, it is, if you want to get out of that subjectivity, is to zoom in on these alternative perspectives, and for that you need to have some sort of an unsettling experience to say, hey, but he was actually befriended with people from the Montessori movements, colonial educators. He was also collaborating in a way. And the other thing I thought it's important also to always question what is. It's better to speak of Indonesian perspectives, but not the Indonesian perspective in colonial, post-colonial history. Yeah.
Terima kasih. Thank you, Marika, for the further explanations on this. And it's now 12 o'clock here, and we are just in time of our schedule. And I still see Andalas University is raising hand, and I'm wondering whether we are going to take one more question and then finish up. Yes, it's okay. Yeah, okay. So the last very chance here is for Andalas University in Padang, who will raise questions. Andalas University, Padang, saya persilakan. Yeah. Say it loudly and clearly, please. Names. It's okay. It's from Padang. Oke, persilakan. Pakai ya, yang keras ya. And slow. Ya. Tes. Suaranya sudah terdengar? Tes. Sudah, suaranya belum terdengar. Ya, silakan. Silakan, Pak. Ya. Ya, belum terdengar suaranya. Silakan. Tes. Ya. Belum terdengar. Atau mau diketikkan adanya pertanyaannya atau bagaimana? Karena suaranya belum terdengar dari sini. Andalas mungkin bersedia mengetikkan pertanyaannya karena suara belum terdengar. Dengan permohonan maaf yang sebesar-besarnya karena waktu semakin berjalan, Andalas apakah ingin mengetikkan pertanyaannya? Diketik saja ya, kita bisa langsung lihat. Silakan. Ya, diketik saja Pak, silakan. Bagaimana? Pertanyaannya sudah bisa diketik atau mau disampaikan langsung? Oke, diketik saja ya, karena belum ada suara terdengar dari Andalas. Ya, diketik saja ya, oke. Terima kasih, diketik. Ya. Bisa diketik pertanyaannya atau mau disampaikan? Halo? Ya, silakan diketik. Ya, karena tidak ada suaranya. Ya, bisa kembali diambil. Mas Tuhan minta tolong. So, while waiting for Andalas University time, the questions, we are happy today because this is the very first time, I believe, that this sort of public lecture is organized by being broadcast direct to and live to different universities throughout Indonesia, and I think this is a good start so that in the coming future, then we're gonna have some more public lectures like this, whether they will be held by UGM or by other universities in different parts of Indonesia. Okay, now from the screen, we are still waiting the questions from Padang, from the city of Padang. Meanwhile, there is a question from State University of Indonesia of Jakarta on this. You get the questions there? Yeah. And the post-colonialitas and.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is. With my lecture, I was not saying that we should avoid looking at the power structures of the colonial state and colonial institutions. We have to take these in account, but we need to think out of these frameworks to find these alternative views. Also, it is also about dreamers and about imagining a better future, which is not necessarily the future of the post-colonial state. But so again, obviously, this is also still about colonial power structures and colonial violence. But the second question, the second part of this question, so an interesting example of how it is actually more complicated is when you look at the history of the colonial police, because of course that is a typical instrument of power, of control, but also in that regard the colonial state was dependent of Indonesians. So the Indonesian police was for 93%. Indonesian colonial, the Dutch East Indies colonial police was for 93% formed by Indonesians, and in the 1930s some of them even became high police officers, and one of them later the head of the Indonesian police. So if you would study their biographies, zoom in on their biographies, you have a story which is on the one hand about colonial power, colonial violence, but it also tells Indonesian histories that should be told as well within the history of post-colonial Indonesia.
Yes, and that is the questions from Andalas is now down there. Can you read that? Yeah. This is about the representations of Buddha. This is not about the Buddha, and I think it's the question comes from that part of the lecture. And yeah, you get that? The Buddha has a bump on his head. It's called Untitled, and a marker in the middle of the forehead called Uma, and his friend from Padang is wondering the meaning of this.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's it's a good question. It's also it's a classic question from art history. But yeah, they both reflect. They are outward symbols of inner perfection of the Buddha. Yeah, and it's all about the serenity, like also the story of his long ears, which are illustrating that he took distance from a worldly longing. So this is one aspect of the Buddha and the Buddha stone, the stone Buddha head and the stone Buddha statue that we might be interested in. But it is also a question which is very much from the framework of classical art history, and I think also in art history it is important that we start thinking to include the broader social-political biography of such a Buddha head. It's not only the stories he has to tell is not only about what was intentionally meant by it, originally meant by it, but also about his life in the trunk of a car and the fear of the wife of the banker. Because these are all interesting stories to tell about such a Buddha head, and they also add to the history of Borobudur. Even if the Buddha head would remain in the Rijksmuseum, as long as we can disclose these other histories, which tell histories about more complex relationships between people and between people and things over time. And again, it's about power, it's about violence, but it's also about beliefs and love and beauty. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, pertanyaannya sudah dijawab ya tentang ini simbol di dalam di kepala Buddha tadi ya, bahwa saya menggambarkan banyak hal sudah dijawab. So, Bapak Ibu dosen dan teman-teman mahasiswa, time is now up and we are going to end this public lecture together. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Marika Bloembergen for this, and let's give a big applause to her. Thank you. Second of all, I would like to thank, on behalf of the History Department of Gajah Mada University, I would like to thank the Perkumpulan Program Studi Sejarah se-Indonesia, PPSI, in particular to the President of PPSI, Dr. Ilham Deng from Makassar, from Central University. Pak Ilham, terima kasih banyak. And also to the Secretary General, Dr. Roma Dwi Arya from State University of Yogyakarta. Ibu Roma, terima kasih banyak. And I would like to thank all of the head of departments and study programs of history who have joined us today this morning for the public lecture from Kendari, from Malang, from Makassar again, from Padang, from Banten, Yogyakarta, and several others. Semarang, of course, from UNES. Once again, thank you. This is the first, again, time that this kind of public lecture is conducted, and I do hope in the future we will still have some opportunities. Dan kesempatan ini saya kira mengingatkan kita, teknisi kita, juga peralatan kita di tempat masing-masing. Mungkin nanti akan ada pembenahan masing-masing, juga jaringan internet. Ternyata tadi tidak stabil juga di ruangan ini ya. Okay, last but not least, and the head of Department of Gajah Mada University, History Department, will deliver some token of appreciation to Marika. Please stand up in the front and silakan. Token of appreciation from the History Department of Gajah Mada University to Professor Marika Bloembergen for this wonderful, inspiring publication.
Saya mau juga terima kasih banyak kepada Departemen Sejarah UGM dan waktu ketolongan feedback untuk buku ini yang saya menulis sama Pak Martijn Eikhoff. Ini untuk perpustakaan. Tapi sebetulnya harus sama dengan Martijn. Akan diskusi. So ini juga on behalf of my colleague and dear friends Martijn Eikhoff, the co-author of the book.
Terima kasih. Thank you very much, Marika, for the presence. The book will be accessible in the library of the Department of History at UGM, and perhaps maybe some of our colleagues would like to have it as well. And last but not least, the PowerPoint material is available here, and I have received some private messages from our friends and other universities to have that PPT PowerPoint materials, and they will be sent and distributed. Yes, okay. Jadi nanti materi PowerPoint-nya akan dikirimkan. Once again, thank you very much, and selamat siang, Selamat beraktivitas, tetap sehat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.